Hello and welcome to Infrastructure Matters by IPWEA, the podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic world of infrastructure, asset management and public works. I'm your host, David Jenkins, Chief Executive of IPWEA. In today's episode, we're diving into the complexities of road infrastructure in Australia and New Zealand. And our special guest is Dr. Geoff Allan, the CEO of Austroads, an expert in the field who shares insights on climate change impacts, sustainable materials and the future of electric vehicle infrastructure. We also discuss the latest advancements in road safety and the challenges of maintaining extensive road networks. So as always, grab a coffee, sit back and let's explore the innovations and strategies shaping our transport network. Good afternoon, and I'm delighted that we've got Geoff Allan, the CEO of Austroads today. Now, I've known Geoff for a number of years. In fact, Geoff started 6 months after I did at the role at IPWEA. And with Austroads, we have a really strong, good relationship, good working relationship. And in fact, we're involved in many of the different committees for Austroads. So delighted to have Geoff along. But just for our audience, I think what would be really helpful, Geoff, is if you would just give a bit of an overview of Austroads, why it exists, and what it is that you do.
Sure. Thanks, David, and thanks for that introduction. So Austroads is the Association of Australian and New Zealand Roads and Transport Departments. So both Commonwealth, State, and we also have ALGA, the Australian Local Government Association, as members. And as you indicated, that through ALGA, IPWEA members participate in our task forces. So Austroads has existed for 90 years. It formed in 1934, and we came together, all states and territories came together through what was then called the Committee of State Roading Authorities. And part of the reason was roads were becoming more important, there were more motorists, and in the 1930s it was a depression, so it was sharing information about better practice, how to manage roads, given there were increasingly constricting budgets, but also coordinating cross-border issues. So given that roads and traffic were crossing interstate borders, that was becoming more important. And for the past 90 years, we've continued to deliver or to undertake research on behalf of our members, so that's pooled research, and then turn it into guidance material. So we have now a guide series of 11 guides, everything from guide to asset management, pavement technology, and bridges, smart motorways, and our most recent guide is in relation to temporary traffic management. So we have those guides and they're available, as I say, free of charge to anyone in Australia to download and use and apply the knowledge that we've been able to generate.
90 years, I actually didn't realise that. And in terms of Austroads, here you look after Australia and New Zealand, but are there other international bodies that do a similar sort of role around the world?
Sure. So we have a close relationship with bodies overseas. So AASHTO, for example, in the US, the American state highways authorities, I think they are, and CEDA in Europe, so the Committee of Road Directorates in Europe. So again, still sharing that international knowledge. But Austroads is also involved in PIAC, and I'm a Vice President of PIAC, and that is the World Road Association. And the reason for the funny acronym, saying PIAC, but it's a World Road Association, when it was formed at the start of last century, it was called the Permanent International Association of Road Congresses.
Wow.
So that's how we got PIAC. But yeah, that's another valuable body in terms of sharing that international knowledge.
And so basically it's sharing best practice, sharing knowledge, producing guidance material to help members and more broadly around general roading and safety and all the things that go with it. Okay, yeah. So let's go into some of the crux of some of the issues that are facing broadly infrastructure assets, but we're obviously going to focus specifically on roading. We've talked a lot recently about the impact of climate change. It's an issue that's facing our members. How does climate change impact infrastructure assets? From a roading point of view, how will roading material, do you think, change in the future? And how will it need to change given that we have climate change in these larger scale weather events?
Sure. Well, I think there are two parts to that question, as you indicated. One is around how do we reduce the carbon intensity of what we do, realising that Australia and most countries around the world now are committed to becoming net zero emitters of carbon by 2050, which is not far away. And the second side of that is resilience. So I'll start with the resilience side first because, Australia, like many parts of the world, are increasingly facing more floods, more fires, more periods of drought, and each of which can have their effect on roads. Now, last year I gave made an appearance before a parliamentary committee on severe weather events on roads, and we spoke around, for example, the effect of floods. And what we've seen, certainly in both in this country and New Zealand, is that if the roads aren't actually prepared well, they wash away, etc. So one of the things we're doing in terms of resilience, we will be producing another guide towards the end of this year, and I'll just use the paraphrase name. That'll be a guide to road resilience, or incorporating resilience into road design, and that'll, as I say, address floods, drought and bushfires. So that's one of the things we will do, and realising, as I say, it's changing, and as we build roads, and increasingly, for example, they will flood. So one of the questions that was asked by the committee is, should we aim to build the national highway system above the 1 in 100-year flood mark?
Yeah.
Well, the reality is there ain't enough money in Australia to do that.
Yeah.
You've got to accept that roads will go under during periods of floods. Mm-hmm. So how do you build them so that you can make sure the seal is maintained and you can clear the roads of debris and get vehicles onto them as fast as possible? Yeah. So the faster you can get vehicles back onto those roads, the faster you can open up communities and bring in the necessary services that are needed. So, as I say, I think in terms of focusing on resilience, and that might mean some change techniques, and one of the things we're working on, and we hope to incorporate this into our guide to pavement technology, is work around foam bitumen, for example. So that's where an additive is added to bitumen. It's slightly more difficult to work with, but it does have what I understand is a better seal and is more flood proof. So that's on the resilient side. So it'll change in terms of, as I say, how roads can survive floods primarily, but other things. In terms of the emissions, I think what we will see when you look at some of the inputs into roads, so particularly elements like concrete, is that concrete is very carbon intensive to produce. Mm-hmm. And we're doing some work with the Cement and Concrete Association and Standards Australia in terms of how we can reduce the carbon intensity of something like concrete, because it's an essential ingredient into roads. And then how would concrete structures change, for example? So how would you be able to build bridges that are still strong and able to carry the loads, but have a lower carbon intensity? So there'll be some changes in that front as well.
If we go back to your first point around resilience, and is that, so obviously looking at materials that are to build new roads, what about retrofitting existing roads? So existing roads, road infrastructure, floods, is there a way in which that can be maintained or retrofitted, or so the impact of flood is less for existing roads? So
it certainly is in terms of reseal. And again, I'm not an engineer, but from what I understand, there are things you can do in terms of reseals which will help alleviate the problems of flooding, but also drainage. So we updated, I think it was the Guide to Road Design, Chapter 5 on hydrology. So realising that the faster you can get the water away, keep it away from the road, the more secure the pavement will be. So there's stuff you can do, I understand, in relation to, as I say, drainage that can try and keep as much water as possible away from roads. Yeah.
In terms of potholes, so. And I mention that because there was an article done by the Grannon Institute quite recently in the AFR and got quite a lot of traction. And then you see some rhetorics come out recently that New South Wales is going to invest another 500 million in potholes. That's obviously all around asset management, maintenance and renewal. So from your purview, what and your perspective around roads and potholes and roads, what can be done nationally? What are we not doing? Because why are we still getting these potholes? Is this an issue around maintenance and renewal? And what sort of advice do you think, or what are we not doing that we should be doing?
I think part of the challenge, and you indicated this, is that it is a big issue. We have now the road network in Australia is a very big asset, and governments are spending money to increase the size of that asset. So you see in Sydney more tunnels, more highways, etc., and freeways. So keeping up the maintenance spend on that is challenging. Now, we did some work for our members, and a synopsis of this we put in a supplementary submission to that parliamentary committee on severe weather events, and it showed exactly as you said that unless maintenance is kept up and there's appropriate, not just sealing of potholes, but appropriate reseals, etc., water is able to get into the seal and causes damage. So look, the key thing I think can be done is funding and increased funding devoted to maintenance, realising we're probably, as a total percentage of road spend, there's probably not as much going into maintenance as there was, say, 15 or 20 years ago. Now, I understand the Commonwealth has stepped up in in the last year or so, and has some extra funding available to local governments in terms of maintenance, but there is still as I say, a significant issue. So funding is probably the best solution to that.
And there is a nuance, isn't there, between New Zealand and Australia? And I know that you cover New Zealand as well. And what is that nuance in terms of maintenance and renewal? We were just talking about it previously.
So, as I understand it, New Zealand has effectively a statutory requirement in terms of managing their assets, which includes spending on maintenance. So, New Zealand have, and again, it's been a while since I read the report, but they, whilst they are still not as well positioned as they probably could be in an ideal world, and realising that there are a lot of call on government's funds and on council's funding. New Zealand, say statutorily, has a better position in terms of devoting money to road maintenance.
Yeah. Let's go now on to sort of looking at materials. So we've done a bit of work more broadly around infrastructure on sustainable materials, use of sustainable materials in the development of infrastructure. And you've already mentioned net zero and a requirement for governments to start looking at that seriously. From a roading perspective, what does the future hold in terms of sustainable materials? Because there's a lot of talk around materials used in roads and recycled glass and all these sorts of things. Can you give us a bit of a perspective on how that's changing? What does the future look like as it relates to materials?
Sure. So certainly we've done a bit of work, or Austroads has done a bit of work in recent years on using some of those alternative materials. So about 2 years ago, we published an extensive study on the use of various plastics in roads. So realising, and this was brought about as a result of the changes in China, which banned the export of plastics and recyclable plastics to China. So, our members asked us to do research and to determine what type of plastics could be accommodated in roads. So I think there's challenges, not just from a traditional roading sense, but certainly roads are being looked at as a means to take or address other recycling problems. So obviously, as we say, plastic, crumb rubber from tyres. Now, Australia has been using crumb rubber in roads for at least, I understand, around about 40 years. And again, looking at how we can use more crumb rubber is certainly an issue, because the tyre stockpiles are certainly increasing. But as you indicated as well, other materials, so certainly looking at crushed glass, and that's both in the surface level but the subsurface level, and where that would mean, and as a bedding, and crushed glass as a bedding, sand for drainage and whatnot. And I think we've done a little bit of work not so long ago on I've forgotten on a couple of other materials, but they're sort of the highlights. Yeah.
And is it gaining traction? Are you seeing there's a take up of these different types of materials being used other than just bitumen? Are you seeing that?
Yeah, so certainly we are working with our partners in RMIT, and I think there are 10 councils in Victoria who are doing a real-life trial of the use of alternative plastics in roads to see what the real effect is. So we were able to fund some of that research, and again, we hope to be able to use that, because there is this demand to use a recycled material.
And is in terms of a reluctance to do it, is it a costing, or is it an understanding? Is it? I mean, as I said, you just said there's a take up, but if we're trying to really move this forward, is there any sort of barriers at the moment?
I think there's a couple of barriers. So one is in terms of cost. So we want to make sure, and I gather we've seen this with some recycled materials, is that we're addressing the issue of recycling in Australia. So we don't want to create an incentive to unnecessary or to subsidise recycled materials so that we'll be an importer of things. So there's a challenge in that regard. There's a challenge in terms of exactly what we know. So as I say, in terms of crumb rubber in bitumen, that's about 40 years old in Australia in terms of using that. But the use of various plastics is relatively new. So we've still got to investigate it. And rightly, people have concerns around what are the long-term effects of this? And you can do modelling and you can do testing using the ELF, etc. But ultimately, you have to see how it performs under actual conditions. So part of the challenge is getting to see the results of actual use. And as I say, with our partners at RMIT, and the councils in Victoria, hopefully we'll get to see the outcomes of that work.
Okay. Now moving on. I know we're sort of moving topic areas here, but this is another area that's obviously of significant interest to your members and also to our members and our broader community. The whole issue around road safety. So how do you think, how can we get safer roads? Are there new, what are some of the issues and challenges that still present themselves? And is there an opportunity, do you think, for new technologies to help develop more safer roads? There's a number of questions in that, but just keen to your thoughts, Geoff.
There are.
Just before you answer, would you mind adjusting the microphone?
Sorry.
It's falling down. If you can keep it just hand width.
Hand width.
Do you want to ask that question again?
Yeah, if you could. You can bring it forward towards you as well.
It's got a mind of its own.
Yeah. Is that? Can we fasten it?
Yeah.
I think that's all right. I'll move back here.
Is that all right? Okay. Okay, I'll ask the question again. So yeah, we're moving around topics a bit here, Geoff, but something that's really important to your members and also to our members and the broader community, road safety, issues around road safety. So how can we get to a point where we have safer roads? What are some of the challenges, the opportunities, and also are there new technologies that can help us get to a point where we certainly reduce the number of accidents that are still current on our roads? Number of questions there, I know, but just keen to hear your thoughts, Geoff.
Sure. I think inherently we've got to remember that roads by their very nature are going to have an element of risk and an element of danger. You've got heavy machines going at great speeds, and injuries and the severe effect on the body are caused by the inability to dissipate that energy. It just gets absorbed in people, whether you're in the vehicle, whether you're outside the vehicle as a pedestrian or someone else who may be hit. So how you dissipate that energy is important. There have been changes in technology in vehicles in terms of side impact airbags and whatnot, which protect the vehicle occupants. But in terms of roads, there's been some low-cost, very effective interventions, certainly in rural roads over the last few years. So about 5 or 6 years ago, we incorporated into our, I think it was a guide to road design, some improvements in terms of, for example, use of wide centre barriers. Yep. So realise that use of wide centre barriers has, and I can't remember the exact figure, but a significant effect in the reduction of road runoff. In that, traditionally, many of the accidents you see in rural areas, people for whatever reason get distracted or tired, and they tend to drift from one side or the other. So the use of very wide centre barriers and then very wide shoulders. When I say very wide, sort of metre and a half centre barriers, metre and a half shoulders, which are actually relatively low cost interventions. And when you add tactile line markings, yep, the reduction in runoff road crashes when those techniques are applied is significant in terms of the additional cost, in terms of cost benefit. It's just significant. Now that's a pretty old-fashioned technology, but it's one that works. And increasingly in places like, or certainly in urban areas, what you're seeing is increasing use of technologies around cameras. So seatbelt cameras, the cameras that look into your car and see if you're playing on your mobile phone, for example, because what we understand, speeding, distracted driving and drug-affected driving all affect the likelihood of someone having a crash. What else are we seeing? So again, increasingly camera technology, things like point-to-point speed cameras. Yep. Again, we know the effect of those things. We know the effect of visible enforcement in maintaining people's or getting people not to speed is very helpful. So anything that sends a message to people to reduce their speed or to reduce the activities that actually pose a greater risk, I think that's important, and as technology is playing a greater role in that space.
Yep. Do you think we'll get to a point where we can seriously do a dent in some of the, unfortunate accidents that are occurring and improve road safety. Do you think that sort of can be exponential over the next 5, 10, 15 years? Or does it still come down to driver, there's this whole element around driver behavior, but with the changes in technologies in cars, some of the changes that you're talking about in developing roads and building roads, do you think we can start to chip away and actually...
I certainly think we can. So when you look at Australia, we have certainly relative to some European countries, a relatively high death toll. Now, I was fortunate to be at the New South Wales Road Safety Summit last week.
Yep.
Now, that's not uniform. You realise in our urban areas, we're almost as safe as the urban areas in Scandinavia, for example.
Yep.
But where we have challenges is to be fair, is in a lot of the rural areas. So it's where people drive longer distances. They have to drive anyway because the public transport and other options aren't there. The roads, as I say, we have a lot of 80 kilometre, 100 kilometre an hour undivided 2-lane roads, which again do provide a challenge in terms of improving road safety. But certainly, and as I say, road safety is one of the highest priorities to our members. And one of the things that our members asked for was to establish a committee, and we've got a committee of both Australian and international experts, which is trying to plot that path towards zero deaths and serious road trauma, and we hope to get there by 2050. So trying to learn from what's going on overseas and apply the best practice in Australia so we can, as I say, not just put a serious dent on it, but certainly try and eliminate road fatalities and road trauma by 2050.
And I guess this is where I think Austroads has a significant, there's a significant advantage here because you can look at best practice around the world. What's happening? What are some countries doing that are really good in terms of road safety? What are some of the interventionist techniques? What are they? And then being able to take some of that best practice and apply it. But I guess it's on the flip side as well. And Australia is also doing some good things in certain areas. And same thing, it can also teach the world. Would that be right?
Oh, certainly. So the wide centre barriers, for example, came from work done by Queensland Department of Main Roads. So David Bobman, before he came to be a program manager at Austroads, led the wide centre lane program in Queensland. The extra wide shoulders came from WA, Western Australia. And certainly it's not just Australia. As part of our members, New Zealand, for example, New Zealand has, as I say, its own challenges, not just financially, but in terms of geographically, but more mountainous than Australia. So innovative road safety designs in more geographically challenged areas, a different environment. So how they use barriers and other things would not be like we do in Australia where we've got more space, but it's innovative and it's appropriate to that landscape. So there's a lot, as I say, there's a lot we can learn from overseas, but conversely, there's a lot that Australia and New Zealand is sharing with the rest of the world.
Yeah. Now, I want to get onto this area around the future and the future world of roads and sort of your thoughts and insights. I mean, no one's got a crystal ball, but what we certainly know is that modes of transport are changing, will change. How are you seeing that all play out, and how do you see the future of roads in the next, say, 10, 20, even 30 years?
Yeah, I think cities are long-lived institutions. The infrastructure lasts a long time.
Yep.
So the basic form of cities is not going to change a lot. But what we're seeing is increasing densification, and that might mean an increase to more cycling, walking, and public transport. But conversely, there will always be powered vehicles. So what we're seeing is an increasing uptake in electric vehicles, for example. And the challenges from what we're hearing is that whilst the public are buying more and more electric vehicles, there are probably insufficient charging stations around the place. So, for example, when I was living in Sydney, I lived in a block of flats. There was no charging in the neighbourhood, or certainly in the complex I lived in. Where I live now in Melbourne, it's in a city, there is not off-street parking. So conversely, it is difficult to charge, and you can't run an electric cable across a footpath into your car. So the provision of public charging stations and, realising charging an electric vehicle is not like filling up at a petrol station. It takes a lot longer, so they've got to park there a longer time. I think that's going to be a challenge, and it may be an opportunity for not just governments but for the private sector to step up. And I think additionally, some of the challenges as we get to alternatively powered vehicles in the heavy vehicle space. So for electric powered buses or electric powered trucks or hydrogen powered trucks, what does it mean with the increased mass of those vehicles, and certainly the increased mass on the drivetrain of those vehicles? What will it mean for our pavements? So it'll mean obviously more pressure and increased wear. But if that increased wear is offset by the benefits of reduced emissions, it's probably a trade-off that's worth making.
Let's go on to that sort of the whole infrastructure for EVs, because I think it's quite interesting. There was one of the speakers we had at our fleet conference last year stood up and basically said, the problem at the moment is that we've seen no commercially viable business model for infrastructure, because as you just said, to do petrol stations, you're there for short term, you're not with this. There's a whole different way of thinking. Do you think, but then I've also read that, it's just a different way of thinking, and there'll be new models. For example, car parks in retail parks will start having EV stations, potentially using that as an additional revenue driver, and people be potentially parking there for a long time. Do you think that that's, that whole sort of technocratic view that we're just going to develop new business models to allow EV vehicles is going to occur, and people will just, entrepreneurs will think of new ways and new business models to do this thing?
I think as humans, we're quite adaptive, and there will be people who will be able to see commercial opportunities, but additionally there are councils and governments that see the community benefit in providing additional infrastructure, additional charging infrastructure. But I think, going back to one of the points you raised earlier around maintenance, and one of the challenges as we shift towards electric vehicles is that the revenue governments may have gotten from fuel excise, for example, will be diminishing. And I think with vehicles where there is an increased ability to be able to attract that movement time of day, you can see the actual effect of that vehicle on a road network, on congestion, and on link that more to the road design. I think there are sort of potentially opportunities if governments want to focus this way. And I know the Infrastructure Australia in its 2015 report said, direct road user charging was certainly something that would make sense in Australia. So I think jumping around a bit, there will be commercial opportunities in terms of charging, but I also think there's potential for new ways of, as I say, charging overall for roads and getting a more equitable spend and making sure that money goes back to the things, to spending on roads where it is needed.
Yeah. Okay, let's just change the tone a little bit. I'm just keen to know a little bit more about, and I do, but just for our audience, just to know a little bit more about your background. And you started off as a town planner, that's right. And then how did you? So you started off a town planner. Then just talk. How did you get to become the CEO of Austroads? How did that all play out?
So it's a long and interesting. Well, it may not be that interesting. It's certainly a long.
No, it's
story.
Interesting, Geoff. Go on, tell us.
So I went to the University of Queensland and studied town planning and worked very briefly as a town planner. And, I'm sure it's a great profession, but it wasn't one for me. So I left that soon after and went to work for the Commonwealth Government. And in one of the areas, that's when the Commonwealth was starting to get involved in cities, and there was a Better Cities program.
Yep.
And I worked in what was then the Department of Housing and Regional Development, and then got into, when some changes in government structures, got into the Commonwealth Department of Transport, which is now Department of Transport, and a few other things. So I've shifted from being a town planner to being what I call was then a transport bureaucrat. But I've had some interesting deviations along the way. At one point, I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency in Queensland as head of strategic and legal policy. But after that, I worked for Queensland Corrective Services, and that was effectively head of corporate services. So it's certainly a different side of life. And I worked with some marvellous people, some marvellous commissioners who I think taught me how to manage, because if you can manage the corrective services system where you have an endless supply of people who are coming into the system, you've got to feed them, house them, make sure everyone is secure, staff, inmates, visitors, and manage that on a very tight budget. And we had some challenges. For example, in 2011, when the floods were on in southeast Queensland, how do you deal with a prison that was totally cut off from any of the outside world?
Yeah, wow.
They were on a flooded island. So certainly taught me how to manage. And after that, I worked for the National, so I went back to Transport, worked for the National Transport Commission in Melbourne, and then in 2019 I started with Austroads as the Chief Operating Officer, and I worked with Nick Koukoulis, who was the then CEO, and Neil Scales, who was the Chair, and Nick left about 6 months after I got there. I don't think I drove him out. I think Nick was always going to retire about that time, and I was fortunate to become Chief Executive after that. So, as I say, I think my experience as a town planner in the transport roles was helpful, but also just that general understanding of how to run things and how to make things happen across the federation. Because going back to one of the points earlier, managing in a federation is difficult. Different states and territories in New Zealand have different legislative frameworks, different capabilities, different interests and whatever. And we've got to try and work with our members to address those things that they think we should work on in common.
Yep.
And, you've touched on all of them today.
Yeah.
Road safety, maintenance, reduction in emissions, and resilience. These are things we've got in common, and hopefully, as I say, we can do things to help our members and help your members as well, and councils, manage those issues.
And I mean, fair to say, even just our conversation now, you're passionate about what you do, and that's obvious. And what success look like for you and Austroads? Where do you see Austroads going into the future, and what is define me success?
Okay, so I do love what I do, and I think part of it is you work with some good people. So good people in our member agencies and the board, and we've got a very good chair in Louise McCormack, who's the Infrastructure Commissioner, amongst other roles in the Northern Territory. But importantly for us, I work with some very good people inside our organisation as well. So all of our programs are headed by very capable people who want to do their bit to improve things. So Ross Guppy, who's in charge of our infrastructure program, who is, I think, a life member of IPWEA in Queensland. Yep. Again, passionate about what he's doing in terms of infrastructure. We've got Michael Newstig, who heads our road safety and design program. Michael's background as a statistician. He's worked for police. He worked for the Transport Accident Commission in Victoria. But again, passionate about improving road safety and improving outcomes. We've got Amy Knowles, who's in our network management space, which is on freight and traffic management and a few other things. Again, highly qualified, passionate engineer, and embracing some of the challenges we were speaking about earlier about movement in place and pedestrianisation and what that means. And Joanne Vanslow, who's joined us recently on the environment and sustainability side, as well as future vehicles. So passionate people, and that's 4 out of 84. Yep. Everyone who works for Austroads and TCA as a business unit within Austroads Transport Certification Australia, we've got some great people. So what does success mean for us? Firstly, that our stuff gets used and it makes a difference. So whether that's our guides, whether it's the telematics on TCA, whether it's some of the things we're doing so we operate this thing called NEVDAS, the National Exchange of Vehicle and Driver Information.
Yep.
So helping our members not just exchange demerit points and driver information or whatever, but one of the things we're trying to do is increase or adopt a national standard for digital driver's licences, for example. So your ability to drive can be verified whether you're driving in Sydney, in Australia, or you're driving in Sweden. Yep. So it's having that verified. But I think success is our stuff gets used and it makes a difference.
And just talking earlier, you've made some real inroads with your guidance material. So over 1 million, is it over 1 million downloads you said last year?
Last year.
And I remember you saying, and I remember our first conversation, which was sort of nearest when you started, you said, look, we've got some great research. We do some really great stuff. It's just, it's getting it out there and actually making people aware. So I guess to end on, what if people want more information, it's to go to the Austroads website, and there's a lot of really useful information on all these topics we talked about. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So go to the Austroads website. And again, I'll jump back and praise my people. Speaking of good people, we've got a great communications team headed by Elena Gardner and some other wonderful people. So yeah, our research is great, but these guys have put it into a form so that it's easily digestible and can be used. So turn it into practical applied guidance material, guidelines, incorporated into our guides, so it can be used. So yeah, go to our website, have a look at our guides, have a look at our guidelines, have a look at whatever's else there. And if I could direct people to one thing, one of the projects we're just wrapping up is we were testing the MASH standards for a bridge crash barrier in Australian and New Zealand conditions, with a 36-ton truck being driven at 90 kilometres an hour. I think it was at a 75-degree angle in a crash barrier to see if it would hold up.
Wow.
It was a great project, but it's great footage. You should have a look at the footage on our website.
And that's on your website as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go and have a look. What was it? How much did you
a lot.
A lot, yeah, a lot of money. So look, Geoff, thank you ever so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure talking to you. As I said right at the start, we have a really good working relationship with Austroads, where there's certainly a lot of crossover, and I've certainly enjoyed your company over the last 3-4 years, and will continue to do so. So thanks for spending some time with us, being very candid and giving us some really good insights and some information on what you do and what's happening in the world of roads. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you to you and your members as well. It's you're not just a good colleague, but a good friend. So thanks.
Thanks, Geoff.
And that brings us to the end of another insightful episode of Infrastructure Matters by IPWEA. A big thank you to our esteemed guest, Geoff from Austroads, for sharing his invaluable insights and experiences in road infrastructure. Today's conversation highlighted not only the challenges we face, but also the innovative solutions and best practices being implemented. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. We hope today's discussion has broadened your understanding of the critical role of road management in our society. Stay tuned for more episodes where we delve into the world of infrastructure and public works. Don't forget to subscribe to our podcast for more engaging conversations. I'm David Jenkins, signing off and reminding you that in the realm of infrastructure, every detail matters.